So how would you describe 2020? The Washington Post sent out to all of their readers a request for one word that would describe 2020. And then what they did is they posted all of the words that were submitted, but they ranked the top 5. And they were words like chaotic, exhausted, relentless. These were the words that people used to describe their experience in 2020. And to be candid, I could resonate. As we're preparing today to record the sermon for this weekend, I got a call this morning and the baptistry was overflowing. It was a bummer, but it was kind of cool to see volunteers and ministers and everybody kind of converge on the auditorium to help. But at the end of the day, we all stood there and thought, is that the best you got, 2020? You see, the whole year has been so difficult that this kind of seemed insignificant, and yet it didn't. Because most of us know that perhaps somewhere along the year, you felt like someone or some circumstance had laid that final straw that broke the camel's back. You might have had a moment where you broke down in tears, or you lashed out in anger, or you felt like in the middle of the night that you couldn't catch any sleep, or you couldn't go to sleep. You felt like if you did wake up, you didn't know how you'd face the day. This has been a tough year. When we hear biblical teachings like the Apostle Paul saying to the Christians in Galatia, do not grow weary in doing good, for at the proper time we'll reap a harvest if we don't give up. And we think, well, I don't want to grow weary in doing good, but I am weary. The Hebrew writer says, don't give up. Don't grow weary. Fix your eyes on Jesus, the author and the perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising its shame. He is now set down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such hardship so that you won't grow weary and give up. Oh, we know that those scriptures are important and they resonate with us right now, but perhaps they've never resonated more than in this final Sunday of 2020. Most of us are just hoping that 2021 is a complete reboot. I heard one person say, I am staying up till midnight on December 31st just to make sure 2020 makes an exit. We know that if those scriptures were written 2 millennia ago, and that people throughout history, all of our foremothers and forefathers, have experienced some form of testing and trial. We know it'll never fully go away, but we also need encouragement to be able to see the rebuild while we're in the midst of the rubble. You see, that is the story of Nehemiah, is it not? Is not the story of Nehemiah the summary story? That somehow in the midst of the rubble, he could see the rebuild before it ever happened. Oh, you think about it. A lot of people like Nehemiah live in relative obscurity during the course of their life. Think about some famous people like Joan of Arc. You do realize she lived only to the age of 19. There was no way she could have known that someday that she would be considered the patron saint of courage and battle and resilient at only the age of 19. I don't know if you've ever heard the name Robert Johnson. He was a jazz and blues guitarist. He lived in relative obscurity. During his lifetime, he mainly played on street corners and in nightclubs and at Saturday night dances. Very few people knew him, and he had almost no commercial success at all during his lifetime. Yet perhaps you have heard of Eric Clapton, Bob Dylan, Keith Richards, Robert Plant, none of whom were alive during Johnson's life. His brief 27 years, all of them said he was the most influential blues guitarist of his time. All of them said he was a great influence on their careers. It's not uncommon for people like Nehemiah, or like Robert Johnson, or like Joan of Arc, or like you and me, to live our lives wondering, is the good we're doing making any difference? It can seem that we spend so much of our time in the rubble of life. We wonder, did the wall ever get rebuilt? Will anyone remember? I think Nehemiah had a clue that perhaps no one would remember but God. In the book of Nehemiah, there are 13 references to his prayer life. In 2 of them, they're almost identical at the end of chapter 5 and the very last words of the book in chapter 13. He just says, God, remember me. He knew he was a temporary governor of a fledgling effort to rebuild a group of refugees who had come home to a battered and destroyed land. He was just one part of this massive rebuilding project, but he took it on with all of his heart. But we also know that Nehemiah faced great trials during the rebuilding project. You see, it wasn't just the fact that the land lay in ruins. It wasn't just that the wall was in ruins. It was that the people themselves were in ruins, and they were surrounded by people who didn't want them to make it. Look with me, if you would, at Nehemiah chapter 2, right at the beginning of the project, in verse 10. When Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official heard about this, they were very much disturbed that someone had come to promote the welfare of the Israelites. Now, let that verse sink in. Does it seem strange to you that someone would be greatly disturbed, greatly incensed? Literally, the Hebrew word means grieved. That someone would want to help a people rebuild. That someone would give their heart, their mind, their soul, their strength to help another group of people rebuild their lives. Why would that make anyone upset? But because Nehemiah chose to give his effort to rebuilding Israel, not only were they against Israel succeeding, they were against Nehemiah succeeding. It's hard to know why they were feeling this way, but I want us to take a moment and look at what they did in order to try to stop him. It begins with his fear of the Persian king in chapter 2 and verse 2. On the trip back from Persia to Israel, it's only about 500 miles by a straight line, but to make the journey, it was about 900 miles of travel time. This could take 2 to 4 months, and it was so dangerous, he actually needed army officers and a cavalry to protect him on the way. When he got there, he was mocked, held in contempt, and treated as if he and the people of Israel were not worth as much as other people. He was the target of their red-hot anger, chapter 4, verses 1 through 3. They were indignant toward him, and he received constant insults. In chapter 4, verses 7 through 9, their anger toward him only increased, as did their insults. In chapter 4, verses 11 and 12, their relentless attack made everything seem so tentative. They really wondered, will we ever get this done? And if we do get it done, will it last? Everything was tentative, and they infiltrated them, threatened to kill them, and threatened to put an end to their work. In chapter 6 and verses 1 through 4, it says that they were scheming to do him harm. They were literally trying to disgrace him. Chapter 6, verses 5 through 9, they lied about him, creating a false story about his intentions to promote himself, make a name for himself. And this had life and death ramifications for Nehemiah. They tried to frighten him and Israel. They tried to convince Nehemiah to run away and abandon the project. They tried to discredit him. They tried to intimidate him. And then in chapter 6, verses 17 through 19, we find a very subtle but difficult challenge. They had people who were on the inside but were more loyal to those who were on the outside trying to discredit Nehemiah. This was very difficult. One of the names mentioned is Meshullam. Meshullam was all in. He not only repaired one part of the wall, he repaired more than one part of the wall. But he was married into a family that was not for the project and did not support Nehemiah. This was extremely difficult for Nehemiah. It would have been so hard on Meshullam, but it was hard on the people to realize all they were facing. So why did they oppose Nehemiah? Why did they oppose the rebuilding of Israel? Nehemiah did not come in with an army and a cavalry to attack, to colonize, to take their farms, to take their temple, to take their lands, to take their fishing areas, to take their hunting grounds. He didn't come in to do any of that. In fact, the only thing Nehemiah came home to do was just to promote the welfare of Israel. He wasn't trying to bother nobody. But the fact that he was trying to help Israel was enough reason for them to bother him. Sometimes people oppose the uplift of others because they have history, or at least they suppose there was bad history between their ancestors. Sometimes people oppose the uplift of someone else because of fear. They believe that if other people regain their strength, rather than living in equality, they assume that people will take revenge on them for past oppression and indignities. Sometimes people oppose the uplift of others because they don't believe there's enough for everyone to thrive. They believe that if someone else rises, it automatically means that they fall, that they lose their own status. It's actually insecurity. Some people oppose the uplift of others because they bought into the lie of supremacy. They believe that their people, tribe, or ethnicity is superior to someone else. Now, some people oppose the uplift of others because they are simply overcome by evil and they are not compassionate, just, fair, or well-intended. They live, at least at some level, like a sociopath. They're not touched in the heart by the damage and destruction they bring on others or that they allow others to do to others. Now, I know I've listed several reasons that people are opposed to the uplift of others. We don't know all of the reasons that the people around Israel were so opposed to their rebuilding or Nehemiah's work, but we know they were, and that made it hard on Nehemiah and on the people. But I want to ask you this question. Have you ever been opposed for trying to do good? Have you tried to help someone and you felt like it backfired? Have you whispered to yourself at times, no good deed goes unpunished? Well, it's hard for us, isn't it? When we're trying to do good, when all we want is just to live a love-first life, when all we want is to follow Jesus, when all we want is to serve the world, when all we want is to uplift others, we think to ourselves, why would anyone oppose that? I can remember when I was a little boy, we had a dog named Charlie. For you dog lovers, he was a Springer Spaniel. He was gentle and fun, but he was a good watchdog. But one day, Charlie got a thorn in his paw. I didn't know how to get it out. I was just a little boy. But our neighbor came to help. He liked Charlie. Charlie liked him. They had always had a friendly relationship. But as soon as he got down there into Charlie's paw and began to try to pull that thorn, Charlie got angry. Charlie bit at him. Charlie snarled at him. Charlie growled at him. Charlie tried over and over again to bite him, to scratch him, as our neighbor gently kept working at trying to get that thorn out of Charlie's paw. Oh, he was doing good for Charlie. But Charlie was fearful. Charlie was hurting. Charlie didn't know what to do, and he didn't know what to make of what our neighbor was doing to him. He finally got that thorn out. Charlie limped away and sat down in the grass and began to lick his paw. It was a few days, perhaps even a few weeks, before he warmed back up to our neighbor. I don't want to pretend to know what a dog thinks or feels or is even capable of thinking or feeling. But it seemed like for a while that Charlie didn't know what to do with someone that was committed to do good for him, even when he was biting at him. What Nehemiah models for us is nothing less than spectacular. You see, because Nehemiah did not return insult for insult, evil for evil. He didn't finally throw up his hands and attack. You see, in essence, he was still committed on the rebuilding. He didn't want to add to the rubble. And how many of you would agree that's hard? Have you been there? Have you found yourself returning insult for insult? Have you got into that heated argument that you later regretted? Have you said some things you wished you could have taken back? I don't know exactly how I would describe 2020. It has been hard. But I know the perfect word for 2021. Grace. What we need more than anything is a little grace. Charlie needed to find in his little dog heart some grace from a neighbor. And my neighbor had plenty of grace for Charlie. Nehemiah knew that whether anyone knew him or not, God knew him. His affirmation didn't come from the people of Israel. It didn't come from his enemies finally realizing he wasn't trying to do anything bad. It didn't come from some aha moment where his enemy stepped up and said, "Oh, hey, Nehemiah, I'm really sorry for the way we treated you." No, within Nehemiah's heart, the affirmation he needed came from God. And in John chapter 8, Jesus echoes that exact same sentiment and says, here's what matters most, is that you would want to do the will of God. The Apostle Paul echoes this. He says, whatever you do in word or deed, just do it for the glory of God. When we focus our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, it gives us the strength to keep doing good and not grow weary. And that doing good, it includes giving grace to each other. Oh, Nehemiah did have a strategy. His strategy was powerful. He faced and acknowledged his fears and met them with prayer and courage. He kept rebuilding as his primary focus, his single focus, and nothing was going to knock him or Israel off the plan to rebuild. They understood that they were fighting for their families and for future generations, and that God was fighting for them. They committed to protecting the lowest points in the wall, the most vulnerable points of the wall. You see, they centered their efforts on making sure that the most vulnerable and the most exposed were protected. They knew if they started there, everyone else in the community would be all right. They didn't make trouble for those who supported the work. They didn't make trouble for those who opposed it. They just stayed focused on what God called them to do, because he believed with all of his heart that restoring the wall and the restoration of the nation was God's plan. That was what was on God's heart. We are going to be living in a time of rebuilding. 2020 has decimated life as we knew it. 2021 gives us opportunity to rebuild life as God wants it. That means that we will be rebuilding our personal spiritual lives. We will be rebuilding our families, rebuilding our relationships, rebuilding workplaces, rebuilding church, school, community, nation, and world. But let me ask you this. Was everything fine before COVID? Did not rebuilding need to take place? Maybe this is an opportunity for us to step into some honesty about the low points in the wall, the vulnerable places that were ignored, the ways that we were complicit in not building the life that God desires, that we could have slipped into not the work that Nehemiah was doing, but the very kind of work that the enemies were doing. Maybe we were the people that were heaping insults on those who were doing good. Maybe we were the people that were frustrating the great work of God. Maybe we were so used to the rubble that all we knew how to do was add to it. And now is the time to reboot, to apply grace and generosity, to focus on the work of God, to the building of the kingdom of God, starting in our own hearts and then rebuilding a love-first family, church, community, and nation. I pray that as you think about 2021 and the reboot of everything, that at the heart of it, we will seek first the kingdom of God together and believe that everything we need will be added as well. Thank you so much for traveling with us this year in such difficult times, with such generosity, with such grace, with such love. Apply grace richly to yourselves as well as to those in your family, your relationships, and your community. Let's step into 2021 filled with faith, hope, and love. And I look forward to seeing what God has in store for us in this new year.